Most people today imagine medieval knights as heroic figures riding proudly across green fields, wearing shining armor and living lives filled with honor and glory. In stories, they rescue the helpless, feast in warm castles, and earn respect wherever they go. But the reality of being a medieval knight was far less romantic. In truth, knighthood was often exhausting, uncomfortable, dangerous, and deeply disappointing. For many who lived it, being a knight simply sucked. To understand why, we must begin at the beginning, long before a man ever wore armor or carried a sword into battle. Becoming a knight was not a sudden rise to glory. It was a long, demanding process that usually started in early childhood. Boys as young as 7 were sent away from their families to live in the household of a lord. There they became pages. Their days were filled not with adventure but with chores. They cleaned floors, carried messages, served food, and learned strict obedience. Mistakes were punished, sometimes harshly, and comfort was rare. Life as a page was not designed to be enjoyable. It was meant to break a child's will and rebuild it into absolute loyalty. Warm beds were uncommon. Food was basic and repetitive, often little more than bread, thin soup, and small amounts of meat when available. Hunger was a constant companion, especially during bad harvest years. Even at this early stage, the dream of knighthood was already losing its shine. Around the age of 14, a page might become a squire. This was where the real hardship began. Squires were assigned to full knights and expected to serve them constantly. They cleaned armor that was heavy, dirty, and smelled of sweat and rust. They cared for horses, which meant long hours shoveling manure, brushing mud-covered coats, and dealing with animals that could easily kick or bite. Injuries were common, and medical care was poor. Training as a squire was brutal. Sword practice was not elegant fencing as shown in movies. It was repetitive, exhausting drilling with heavy wooden weapons that bruised arms and numbed hands. Armor training was worse. Chunmal alone could weigh over 20 kilograms, and later plate armor added even more weight. Wearing it for hours under the sun caused dehydration, heat exhaustion, and constant soreness. There was no modern padding, no ventilation, and no relief. Even worse, squires were expected to follow their knights into real battles. This meant witnessing violence at a very young age. Medieval warfare was not clean or heroic. It was chaotic, loud, and horrifying. Squires saw men screaming in pain, bleeding to death, or crushed beneath horses. They helped remove armor from wounded knights, often discovering that the body inside was broken beyond saving. These images stayed with them for life. If a squire survived long enough and proved loyal enough, he might finally be knighted. The ceremony itself was often short and symbolic, involving an oath of loyalty, religious prayers, and a light blow to the shoulder or neck. This moment was supposed to mark the beginning of honor and prestige, but for many new knights, it marked the beginning of even greater hardship. One of the biggest problems was money. Despite popular belief, most knights were not wealthy. Armor, weapons, horses, and servants were incredibly expensive. A full suit of armor could cost the equivalent of many years of income for a common worker. Maintaining it required constant repairs. Horses needed food, shelter, and care. If a knight did not come from a rich family or have a generous lord, he often lived in debt. Many knights owned little or no land. Without land, they had no reliable income. This forced them to serve powerful lords in exchange for protection and basic support. Such service meant absolute obedience. A knight could be sent to fight in distant wars, guard cold and isolated castles, or suppress local revolts. Refusal was not an option. Disobedience could lead to loss of status, imprisonment, or death. Daily life for a knight was far from comfortable. Castles were cold, damp places. Stone walls trapped moisture and fires provided limited warmth. During winter, rooms were freezing. Blankets were heavy but insufficient. Hygiene was poor. Baths were rare, and lice, fleas, and rats were common companions. The smell of unwashed bodies, animals, and waste filled the air. Food, while sometimes better than that of peasants, was still repetitive and unreliable. Bread, porridge, salted meat, and weak ale made up most meals. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal luxuries. During famines, even knights went hungry. Malnutrition weakened their bodies, making them more vulnerable to illness and injury. Illness itself was a constant threat. Medieval medicine was based on superstition and limited knowledge. Infections from small wounds could become deadly. A simple cut from armor rubbing against skin might turn into a life-threatening problem. Plague swept through towns and castles alike, killing rich and poor without distinction. Knights, despite their armor, had no protection against disease. Religion added another layer of pressure. Knights were expected to be deeply religious, constantly aware of sin and divine judgment. They were taught that violence was acceptable only when sanctioned by God or their Lord. This created an inner conflict. Killing in battle was praised, yet feared as a danger to the soul. Many knights lived with guilt, anxiety, and fear of eternal punishment. Sleep itself was often poor. Knights slept on hard beds or straw mattresses. Noise was constant: snoring, coughing, animals, guards changing shifts. True rest was rare. Before battles, sleep was nearly impossible due to fear and anticipation. After battles, pain and injuries made rest difficult. So even before considering combat, the life of a medieval knight was already exhausting, uncomfortable, and stressful. The shining armor hid a reality of cold nights, constant labor, hunger, fear, and debt. The dream of glory faded quickly, replaced by the heavy weight of duty and survival. And yet this was only the beginning, because for knights, the worst suffering often came not from daily life, but from the battlefield itself. From a distance, medieval armor looks impressive. Shining metal plates, strong helmets, and heavy shields create the image of an invincible warrior. But for the knight wearing it, armor was less like protection and more like a moving prison. It restricted movement, caused constant discomfort, and slowly exhausted the body long before the battle even began. Putting on armor was not a quick task. A knight could not dress himself fully. He needed help from squires or servants to fasten straps, tie laces, and adjust plates. The process could take 30 minutes or more. Even before stepping onto the battlefield, a knight was already tired. Each piece added weight, pressing down on shoulders, hips, and knees. Chunmal was often worn underneath plate armor. Made of thousands of interlinked metal rings, It was flexible but extremely heavy. Worn for hours, it dug into the skin, pinched flesh, and rubbed raw spots on the body. Padding was minimal and often made of thick cloth or leather that absorbed sweat and became stiff and uncomfortable. Plate armor, which became more common in later medieval periods, brought new problems. While it offered better protection against blades, it trapped heat. Under the sun, armor turned into an oven. Sweat poured down the body, soaking clothing and blinding the eyes. Dehydration was common, and water was not always available. Some knights collapsed from heat exhaustion without ever being struck by an enemy. Breathing inside a helmet was another challenge. Visors limited airflow and visibility. Each breath felt heavy and warm. In the chaos of battle, panic could set in simply from the sensation of suffocation. Knights sometimes lifted their visors during fights just to breathe, exposing their faces to deadly blows. Movement was slow and exhausting. Running was nearly impossible. Climbing hills, stepping over bodies, or rising after falling required immense effort. If a knight fell to the ground, getting back up could be a struggle. In muddy or uneven terrain, some knights were trampled by horses or finished off by foot soldiers while helpless on the ground. Contrary to popular belief, armor did not make knights immune to injury. Blunt force from maces, hammers, or falling horses could crush bones inside the armor. A strike did not need to cut through metal to kill. Broken ribs, shattered limbs, and internal bleeding were common. The armor protected the body, but not the pain. Even wearing armor outside of battle was unpleasant. Knights often had to travel long distances fully armored or partially armored for safety. This meant hours of riding with metal rubbing against skin and joints. Sores and infections developed easily. Once infected, wounds were difficult to treat and often deadly. Helmets also isolated knights from the world around them. Vision was narrow, hearing was muffled, and communication was difficult. Orders were misunderstood. Allies were mistaken for enemies. Chaos ruled the battlefield, and confusion killed as many men as weapons did. When battles ended, the suffering did not stop. Removing armor revealed bruises, cuts, and deep aches. Muscles were strained, joints inflamed, and skin damaged. There was no rest period or physical therapy. Knights were expected to recover quickly and be ready for the next conflict. Armor also required constant maintenance. Rust formed quickly, especially in wet climates. Cleaning and oiling metal took hours of work. Damaged pieces had to be repaired by expensive armorers. For poor knights, broken armor could mean financial ruin or death in the next battle. In reality, armor was a necessary burden, not a luxury. It protected knights just enough to send them back into danger again and again. It weighed down their bodies, trapped their heat, limited their senses, and slowly wore them down. And still, despite all this suffering, armor was only one part of the nightmare. Because no matter how heavy the metal or how strong the shield, it could not protect a knight from what truly awaited him in battle. Medieval stories often describe battles as moments of honor, bravery, and heroic duels between noble warriors. The reality was far different. Battle for a medieval knight was terrifying, confusing and brutally chaotic. There were no clear lines, no dramatic speeches, and no guarantee of survival, no matter how skilled or well-equipped a knight might be. Before a battle even began, fear filled the air. Knights knew that injury or death was likely. They had seen friends die in previous conflicts. They understood that armor could fail, horses could panic, and luck could turn instantly. Many knights prayed intensely before battle, not for victory, but simply to survive the day. When the fighting started, noise overwhelmed everything. The clash of metal, screams of wounded men, neighing of horses, and shouted orders created a deafening storm. Inside a helmet, sounds echoed strangely, making it difficult to tell where danger was coming from. Commands were lost, misunderstood, or ignored entirely. Organization broke down almost immediately. Visibility was terrible. Dust, smoke, and movement filled the battlefield. Knights could see only a narrow section in front of them. Enemies appeared suddenly and vanished just as quickly. There was no time for careful swordplay. Fights were fast, desperate, and brutal. Survival depended more on position and luck than on skill. Knights rarely fought noble duels. Most enemies were common soldiers armed with spears, axes, or farming tools turned into weapons. These men aimed not for honor but for survival. They attacked in groups, targeting weak points. A knight who was pulled from his horse or knocked to the ground was immediately surrounded and overwhelmed. Being unhorsed was one of the greatest dangers. A knight on foot, weighed down by armor, was slow and vulnerable. Infantry soldiers stabbed at gaps in armor, such as the neck, armpits, or groin. Daggers were used to finish off fallen knights at close range. Death was quick, messy, and merciless. Even mounted combat was dangerous. War horses were powerful but easily frightened. Loud noises, blood, and fire caused them to panic. A frightened horse could throw its rider or run blindly into danger. When horses fell, they often crushed the knights beneath them, breaking bones and trapping them under immense weight. Injuries were horrific. Limbs were severed, faces crushed, and bodies torn apart. Pain was intense and constant. There were no effective painkillers. Wounded knights lay on the field for hours, sometimes days, crying out for help that never came. Many died not from their wounds, but from exposure, infection, or thirst. Victory brought little relief. The battlefield after combat was a place of horror. Dead bodies covered the ground. The wounded begged for mercy. Knights walked among the fallen, searching for friends or looting enemies. The smell of blood, sweat, and waste filled the air. These images haunted survivors long after the battle ended. Captivity was sometimes worse than death. Knights captured by the enemy were often held for ransom. While this might sound preferable to dying, captivity could last months or years. Prisoners were kept in poor conditions, given little food, and treated harshly. If their families could not pay, they might be imprisoned indefinitely or executed. Even when a knight survived battle and returned home, the experience left scars. Nightmares, anxiety, and constant fear were common. There was no understanding of trauma or mental health. Knights were expected to endure silently, showing strength and loyalty despite their suffering. Battle was not a moment of glory. It was confusion, fear, pain, and death. Every time a knight rode into combat, he knew he might never return, and even if he did, part of him would be lost forever on the field. Yet battle was not the only danger a knight faced. Even in times of peace, life remained harsh and uncertain, because when swords were sheathed, another kind of struggle began. Many people assume that knights only suffered during battles, but the truth is that the majority of a knight's life was spent outside combat, and it was far from comfortable. Peaceful times were not restful vacations. They were filled with endless work, worry, and frustration. In fact, for many knights, life between battles was even more grueling than fighting itself. A knight's responsibilities extended beyond the battlefield. He was expected to serve his lord loyally at all times, which meant guarding castles, patrolling borders, and enforcing authority over peasants. These tasks were tedious, repetitive, and often dangerous. Knights spent long hours riding through muddy fields, forests, or cold winds, rarely stopping for comfort. Horses were expected to endure the same conditions, and caring for them consumed much of the day. Castles, while imposing, were not cozy homes. Stone walls offered protection but little comfort. Rooms were cold, drafty, and damp. Fireplaces barely warmed the air, and smoke filled the halls. Privacy was rare. Knights often shared rooms with other men or squires, sleeping on hard beds or straw-filled mattresses. Noise, lice, and rodents made restful sleep difficult. Even when exhausted, a knight rarely enjoyed peace. Food was monotonous and unreliable. A knight's diet often consisted of bread, porridge, salted meat, and weak ale. Fresh fruit and vegetables were rare outside of harvest seasons. Meat, when available, was heavily salted or smoked for preservation, leaving it tough and bland. Sometimes knights went hungry due to poor harvests, political disputes, or the whims of their lord. Hunger and malnutrition were constant companions. Social life was equally challenging. Knights were expected to maintain appearances, attend feasts, and participate in tournaments, but these events were more stressful than enjoyable. Feasts were opportunities to impress lords, allies, or potential patrons. Manners, etiquette, and loyalty were scrutinized. A careless word or gesture could damage a knight's reputation, jeopardizing his position or income. Tournaments, often depicted as exciting jousts, were dangerous and exhausting. Knights risked serious injury, even death, for honor or small prizes. Unlike battles, tournaments were theatrical but unforgiving. Horses could stumble, lances could shatter, and competitors could break limbs in the most mundane ways. A single mistake could end a career or life. Financial concerns loomed constantly. Knights required expensive equipment, from armor to horses to weapons. Maintaining these necessities was costly. Poor knights struggled to pay for repairs, food for horses, or even basic living expenses. Debt was common, and failure to maintain equipment or appearances could result in social disgrace or loss of employment. Travel, another common duty, was often unpleasant. Knights rode long distances on difficult roads or through forests filled with bandits. Weather was rarely kind. Rain, snow, and mud made every journey exhausting and dangerous. Lodging was unreliable. Inns were crowded, filthy, and expensive. In some regions, knights had no choice but to sleep under trees or in barns, exposed to the elements. Disease was an ever-present threat. Poor sanitation, contaminated water, and close quarters in castles made illness inevitable. Even minor wounds could become deadly due to infection. Plagues or epidemics struck without warning, killing peasants and knights alike. There were no antibiotics, painkillers, or modern treatments, so sickness and injury were often slow, painful processes. Mental strain was as significant as physical hardship. Knights were expected to uphold codes of honor and piety while performing violent and morally questionable duties. They had to suppress fear, anxiety, and grief, projecting confidence at all times. Constant stress, combined with exhaustion, hunger, and injury, took a heavy toll on both body and mind. Even the promise of reward was unreliable. Lords could be stingy, promises of land or money were often broken, and political intrigues could strip a knight of favor in an instant. Loyalty was demanded, but reward was uncertain. A knight might serve for years without tangible benefit, watching others gain wealth and prestige while he remained in hardship. In short, life between battles offered little comfort, little security, and few pleasures. Knights did not live in the romanticized world of castles and courtly love. They endured constant labor, hunger, illness, and uncertainty. Their shining armor could protect them in battle, but it offered no relief from the struggles of daily life. And yet, even this harsh routine could not prepare them for the personal and social pressures that weighed heavily on every knight. Expectations that were sometimes more terrifying than the battlefield itself. Being a knight wasn't just about wearing armor or fighting battles. Every knight carried the weight of expectations, social, religious, and personal, that could be as exhausting as any battlefield. Failure to meet them could bring shame, punishment, or worse. In many ways, these pressures made life even more miserable than the physical hardships of knighthood. First, there was the social expectation. Knights were supposed to be models of courage, loyalty, and honor. They were expected to protect their lord's lands, defend the weak, and display bravery at all times. Even small mistakes could tarnish a reputation built over years. For a poor or inexperienced knight, this pressure could feel unbearable. One failure in combat or one perceived slight at a feast could result in mockery, loss of respect, or exclusion from social circles. Courtly expectations added another layer. Knights were often required to participate in elaborate ceremonies, jousts, or feasts. They had to know proper etiquette, dress appropriately, and act in ways that reflected honor and nobility. A simple misstep, such as spilling wine or addressing a lord incorrectly, could create embarrassment or tension. Knights lived in a constant state of vigilance, watching their words, gestures, and appearance at all times. Religious expectations were equally demanding. Medieval society was deeply religious, and knights were expected to be devout. They attended Mass, prayed frequently, and were reminded constantly that God was watching their actions. The paradox was that they were also expected to kill in battle, sometimes against fellow Christians, which created guilt and moral anxiety. Questions about sin and salvation weighed heavily on a knight's mind. adding mental stress to the already difficult physical life. Knights also faced family expectations. Many came from noble families that demanded success, honor, and loyalty. A knight who failed to bring glory to his family could be disowned, ridiculed, or disrespected. Pressure to succeed in tournaments, wars, or political maneuvering could be overwhelming. The fear of disappointing parents or relatives was constant, and for some, it overshadowed even the dangers of combat. Economic pressures compounded the stress. Knights were expected to maintain expensive equipment, horses, and clothing. If a knight could not afford these necessities, he risked ridicule or even being dismissed by his lord. Debt was common, and failure to pay could lead to imprisonment or forced labor. Many knights spent more energy worrying about finances than fighting actual enemies. Peer pressure was relentless. Knights judged each other constantly. A single act of cowardice or failure in battle could lead to lifelong stigma. Even experienced knights lived in fear of losing reputation, and young knights felt the pressure acutely. Survival required not only skill but also careful management of perception, diplomacy, and alliances. Additionally, political expectations were difficult to navigate. Knights often served multiple lords who might have conflicting interests. A knight caught in political intrigue could lose favor, lands, or even life. Aligning with the wrong side, supporting a failed rebellion, or making an enemy of a powerful noble could have disastrous consequences. Loyalty was required, but determining whom to trust was never easy. Personal expectations added yet another layer. Many knights dreamed of glory, fame, and recognition, only to find that reality rarely matched fantasy. The idealized vision of heroic deeds, wealth, and prestige often gave way to fatigue, injury, and monotony. Each knight struggled with disappointment, the frustration of unmet ambitions, and the gap between expectation and reality. Even moments of success could be hollow. Winning a battle or tournament often brought little more than temporary recognition. Long-term security and wealth were not guaranteed. The constant cycle of pressure, responsibility, and anxiety became exhausting. Knights rarely experienced true rest or peace of mind. In summary, knighthood imposed relentless social, religious, economic, and personal expectations. Even outside the battlefield, knights carried heavy burdens on their shoulders, often heavier than the armor that weighed down their bodies. The life of a knight was not only physically demanding but mentally exhausting, with little relief from the constant scrutiny and demands of medieval society. And while all these pressures wore knights down, there was another harsh truth waiting for them. The people they were supposed to protect often despised them. Medieval knights are often remembered as noble defenders of the weak, champions of justice, and pillars of society. In reality, the people they were supposed to protect, the peasants, often despised them. The disconnect between knightly ideals and daily life created tension, resentment, and sometimes outright hostility. For a knight, this meant that even in peaceful times, life could be stressful and isolating. One major reason for this animosity was taxation and feudal obligations. Knights served lords who controlled vast estates, and the peasants were responsible for providing labor, crops, and money. Knights were often tasked with enforcing these obligations. Collecting taxes or demanding service from exhausted, starving peasants was a dangerous and thankless job. Many knights were forced to be harsh, punishing those who resisted or failed to meet expectations. This made them deeply unpopular. Knights also served as enforcers of law and order, but medieval law was rarely fair. Justice often favored the wealthy or powerful. Knights might arrest, beat, or even execute peasants accused of minor offenses. The distinction between right and wrong was blurred, and many peasants saw knights as instruments of oppression rather than protection. Fear and resentment replaced gratitude. The lifestyle of a knight also created social tension. Knights were expected to live with wealth, fine clothing, and horses, symbols of privilege that reminded peasants of their own poverty. Festivals, feasts, and tournaments showcased luxury that peasants could never attain. While knights endured hardships, they were still part of an elite class that separated them from the common people. This disparity fueled jealousy and disdain. Knights often relied on peasants to maintain their equipment and horses. These men were tasked with hard labor, cleaning armor, carrying heavy supplies, and caring for horses and weapons. Mistreatment of servants, or simply the physical exhaustion imposed by their work, could create resentment toward their knightly masters. A knight's survival depended on the labor of others, but gratitude from peasants was rare. Violence also worsened relations. Knights were armed and trained for combat. Even small disputes could escalate into brutal attacks. If a knight felt disrespected or threatened, he might respond with force. Peasants living under constant threat of violence learned to fear and avoid knights whenever possible. The romantic image of chivalry rarely extended to real-life interactions. Moreover, knights could demand loyalty and obedience from local populations. Resistance, whether due to hunger, poverty, or disagreement with lordly decisions, was met with punishment. Rebellions were common in medieval Europe, and knights often had to fight the very people they were supposed to protect. Defending lords' interests sometimes meant attacking villages, burning homes, or taking livestock. These actions created hatred and lifelong grudges. Even when a knight acted honorably, his deeds were often misunderstood or ignored. Stories of bravery, loyalty, or sacrifice rarely reached the common folk. What peasants experienced directly was hunger, forced labor, and violence. Gratitude was replaced by suspicion and resentment. Knights could be praised in noble circles, yet despised by those whose daily lives they affected most. Finally, isolation compounded the problem. Knights lived between worlds, part elite warrior, part servant of a lord. They could not fully integrate with the nobility unless they were wealthy or politically skilled, and they were alien to the peasants who worked the land. This left many knights lonely, misunderstood, and constantly aware of the animosity around them. Even in a peaceful village, life could be tense and uncomfortable. In short, peasants often saw knights as oppressors, not protectors. Wealth, violence, and obligations created barriers that could not be bridged. For a knight, this meant another layer of hardship, social alienation, fear of attack, and the constant pressure to maintain status while being hated by those around him. Life as a knight was not only exhausting physically, but mentally and emotionally as well. And while the peasants may have hated them, a knight's own comrades could be just as treacherous, creating yet another source of stress and danger. Being a knight didn't just mean facing enemies on the battlefield or dealing with resentful peasants. Often, one of the most dangerous threats came from fellow knights. Competition, jealousy, and ambition created a world where danger lurked even among comrades. For many knights, navigating these relationships was just as exhausting, and sometimes more deadly, than fighting in wars. Knights were part of a hierarchical society in which status and reputation mattered immensely. Prestige could mean better assignments, richer rewards, or favorable marriages. Because of this, rivalries were common. Young knights often competed to impress lords, demonstrate courage in tournaments, or earn favor at court. One mistake could allow another knight to overtake them socially or financially. Tournaments, which might seem like fun competitions, were often arenas of subtle and not so subtle political maneuvering. Knights fought for prizes, but they also fought to showcase skill, intimidate rivals, and assert dominance. Injuries were frequent, and sometimes rivalries turned deadly. A single joust could permanently injure a knight or end his career, leaving him vulnerable in more ways than one. Even outside tournaments, knights competed constantly. They vied for assignments, contracts, or military commands. Lords had limited resources and favored some knights over others. Those who were overlooked or insulted often resorted to sabotage, gossip, or even violence. Friendship and loyalty were fragile, often overshadowed by ambition and greed. This competition extended to battlefield situations as well. In theory, knights were supposed to cooperate, but confusion in the heat of combat created opportunities for betrayal or misjudgment. Rival knights might charge recklessly to impress their lord, leaving others exposed. Miscommunication could turn allies into unintended enemies. One misstep could result in injury or death, even if the knight's opponent was nominally friendly. Ambition also bred resentment within groups of knights. Those from wealthy families or prestigious lineages often received better armor, horses, and supplies. Poorer knights had to work harder, risk more, and endure harsher conditions just to prove themselves. Social inequality fueled envy and tension, creating an environment of constant psychological stress. Political intrigue among knights added another dangerous dimension. Knights were not only warriors, they were often involved in court politics, alliances, and disputes. Aligning with the wrong faction could be disastrous. A seemingly loyal knight could be accused of treachery, arrested, or even assassinated. Trust was scarce, and suspicion was constant. Sometimes, rivalries escalated outside formal duties. Duels and challenges were common ways to resolve disputes over honor, insult, or romantic competition. These encounters, often fought in secrecy, could leave a knight dead or permanently disabled. Even surviving such duels did not end the tension. A lifetime of grudges could follow, with no easy escape. The psychological burden was severe. Knights had to remain vigilant not only against enemies on the battlefield but also against their peers. Every conversation, every gesture, and every favor had to be considered carefully. Paranoia was a survival skill. Friendships were fragile, alliances were temporary, and betrayal could come from the most trusted companion. In short, rival knights were not merely competitors. They were constant sources of danger, stress, and pressure. For a medieval knight, the threat did not end with the enemy army or the peasant's resentment. Even those meant to be comrades could become the most unpredictable and deadly challenge of all. And yet, even this constant vigilance could not protect knights from one of the most feared elements of medieval life: disease. While battles, rivalries, and harsh living conditions made life difficult for medieval knights, disease was an invisible enemy that could strike at any time. Illness was common, unpredictable, and often fatal. No amount of armor, strength, or skill could protect a knight from sickness, and medical care was primitive at best. Hygiene in the medieval world was poor. Knights spent long periods in castles, stables, and battle camps, often in close quarters with others. Bathing was infrequent, clothing was rarely washed, and lice and fleas were constant companions. Wounds became easily infected. Small cuts, scratches from swords or armor, or even bites from horses could turn into deadly infections. Plagues and epidemics swept through Europe with terrifying speed. The most infamous, the Black Death of the 14th century, killed millions, including knights. Disease did not discriminate. Even a well-armored, strong, and disciplined knight could fall victim. Campaigns often brought knights into towns and villages with poor sanitation, spreading illness further. Medical knowledge was limited and often based on superstition. Treatments included bloodletting, herbal remedies, prayers, and mystical rituals. Surgeons had little understanding of infection or germs. Infections that might be treated easily today were almost always fatal. Broken bones, deep cuts, and burns often led to long, painful deaths. Even routine medical care was risky. Amputations were performed without anesthesia, and operations were done in unsanitary conditions. Pain was intense, and survival was uncertain. Knights who survived battle wounds often faced years of chronic pain, limited mobility, or permanent disability. Hunger and poor nutrition made knights more susceptible to disease. Although they were better fed than peasants, meals were monotonous, lacking in vitamins, and often spoiled. Malnutrition weakened the immune system. A knight might survive combat only to fall ill with something as simple as dysentery, typhoid, or influenza. Camps and battlefield conditions made matters worse. During campaigns, knights lived in temporary shelters or tents, exposed to rain, mud, and cold. Contaminated water, spoiled food, and overcrowding created ideal conditions for disease. Entire units could be wiped out without a single sword strike, simply because illness spread faster than armies could move. Mental stress worsened vulnerability. Anxiety, exhaustion, and constant vigilance against enemies and rivals weakened the body's defenses. Sleep deprivation and physical strain further reduced the ability to fight off infection. Knights were expected to endure, but their bodies were often unable to cope. Disease was also socially isolating. A knight struck by illness might be quarantined or abandoned temporarily. Those who survived were sometimes marked as weak, vulnerable, or unlucky. This could damage reputation and reduce opportunities for service, advancement, or wealth. Even after recovery, lingering effects often remained. Chronic pain, fatigue, or deformities were common. Some knights never fully regained strength or mobility, limiting their effectiveness in battle and daily duties. The invisible threat of disease was relentless, unpredictable, and often more dangerous than any enemy on the battlefield. In short, medieval knights faced countless visible dangers, but disease was an ever-present, unseen killer. Armor and skill could not stop it. Training, courage, and loyalty did little to protect against infection, plague, or poor medical care. For a knight, survival often depended on luck as much as on bravery. And as if disease wasn't enough, there were yet other dangers, some psychological, some political, and some so unpredictable that even the strongest knights could not escape them. For a medieval knight, danger did not only come from swords, disease, or rival knights. Political intrigue and shifting loyalties were constant threats, adding mental and emotional strain to an already exhausting life. Navigating medieval politics was like walking through a minefield. One wrong step could mean disgrace, imprisonment, or death. Knights served lords who controlled lands, armies, and influence. Loyalty was expected, absolute, and often tested. A knight's survival depended on remaining in favor, but favor was unpredictable. A lord could be pleased one day and angry the next, sometimes for reasons beyond a knight's understanding. Even minor mistakes or misunderstandings could have serious consequences. The political landscape was unstable. Alliances shifted frequently. A lord who had been a friend yesterday could become an enemy tomorrow due to marriage, land disputes, or war. Knights had to adapt quickly, sometimes fighting former allies or betraying previous supporters. Each decision carried high stakes, and miscalculations could ruin careers or lives. Knights were also caught in the web of feudal obligations. They owed military service, counsel, and obedience to their lords. At the same time, lords often owed them rewards, protection, or land. Failure to receive promised compensation could create tension, resentment, and even rebellion. Knights sometimes found themselves negotiating survival while performing dangerous duties without reward. Intrigue among knights themselves added complexity. Ambitious knights sought advantage wherever possible. Friendships were fragile, loyalty could be bought, and betrayal was common. A knight who trusted the wrong comrade could be set up for failure, ambushed, or sabotaged. Suspicion and paranoia became part of daily life, as even allies could pose threats. Political pressures extended beyond the battlefield. Knights were expected to participate in councils, serve as envoys, and enforce their lord's will among peasants or neighboring territories. This often meant mediating disputes, collecting taxes, or suppressing rebellion. Each task carried the risk of angering someone powerful. Failure could be punished harshly. Success was rarely rewarded as fully as promised. Marriage and family politics added another layer of stress. Knights often married for alliances, wealth, or social advancement rather than love. A poorly chosen marriage could weaken status or create tension with powerful families. Children's inheritances and futures depended on careful management of these relationships, adding yet more responsibility. Even victories could be politically dangerous. Success in battle might earn admiration, but it could also breed envy. A knight who gained too much recognition risked becoming a target of rivals or the king's suspicion. Demonstrated skill and leadership could provoke jealousy, sabotage, or assassination attempts. Survival required not just courage but constant strategic thinking. In short, medieval politics were a deadly game. Knights lived under constant pressure to navigate alliances, obligations, and rivalries. Even the strongest, bravest, or most skilled knight could fall victim to betrayal, misjudgment, or shifting loyalties. Political life demanded vigilance, cunning, and flexibility, skills that had to be learned in addition to swordsmanship and horsemanship. Life as a knight was exhausting physically, mentally, and emotionally. Every day carried the potential for injury, humiliation, or death, whether on the battlefield, among peers, or at court. And yet, knights were also expected to maintain a public image of honor, courage, and control, no matter how chaotic or dangerous life had become. If surviving politics, disease, and battle wasn't enough, there was one more harsh reality for knights: retirement, old age, and the bitter end of life, often full of disappointment and regret. For many medieval knights, the life of hardship did not end with the battlefield, tournaments, or service to lords. Aging brought a new set of difficulties that few stories mention. Knights who survived wars, rivalries, disease, and political intrigue often faced old age with little comfort, declining health, and bitter disappointment. The glory they sought rarely lasted into later years. Physical decline was inevitable. Armor that once fit perfectly became cumbersome. Injuries from battles, broken bones, dislocated joints, and muscle damage worsened with age. Chronic pain made even simple tasks exhausting. Knights who had relied on strength and endurance found themselves slower, weaker, and less capable, vulnerable to enemies and unable to perform duties that had defined their lives. Horses, once loyal partners in battle, also aged and became harder to maintain. War horses were expensive, and older animals required more care, food, and rest. Knights who could not afford to replace or maintain their mounts often lost mobility, status, and their ability to serve effectively. For those whose lives depended on cavalry, this was a serious blow. Financial worries increased with age. Maintaining armor, weapons, and property became more difficult. Knights who had failed to secure lands, wealth, or rewards during their prime years faced poverty. Some relied on meager pensions, charity from lords, or support from family. Others were forced to sell possessions or live in relative destitution. For many, old age was synonymous with insecurity. Social status could decline as well. Younger, more ambitious knights replaced aging veterans in the eyes of lords and courts. Feudal politics shifted constantly, and loyalty alone was not enough to maintain favor. A once respected knight could find himself ignored, sidelined, or ridiculed. Reputation, once a source of pride, could fade as quickly as it had been built. Health was a constant concern. Medieval medicine was limited, and age-related illnesses were rarely treated effectively. Infections, digestive issues, and respiratory problems could be fatal. Pain was often chronic, and relief was minimal. Knights who had faced death on the battlefield were sometimes defeated by something as simple as a fever or untreated injury. Isolation was common. Friends and comrades from youth were often dead or retired. Younger knights dominated social circles and tournaments, leaving older knights marginalized. Loneliness compounded physical and mental struggles. Many knights spent their later years reflecting on past battles, losses, and missed opportunities, often with regret and melancholy. Psychological strain was significant. After decades of danger, stress, and responsibility, some knights experienced depression, anxiety, and despair. The ideals of honor, glory, and nobility often clashed with the harsh realities of survival, failure, and aging. The dreams that had motivated them as young men, prestige, adventure, and recognition, often remained unfulfilled. Even death carried its own uncertainties. Knights who died in old age rarely received the heroic funerals depicted in romantic stories. Burial rites depended on wealth, family status, and local customs. Some were interred quietly in churchyards, forgotten by the world they had once sought to impress. Death, in many cases, was simply the final hardship after a lifetime of struggle. In the end, the life of a knight was a cycle of labor, danger, and disappointment. The shining armor, the gallant battles, and the supposed honor were only temporary reliefs in a world dominated by hardship, expectation, and uncertainty. Few knights reached old age with wealth, health, and satisfaction. Most faced the bitter reality of a life spent in service, suffering, and struggle. And while old age was challenging, some knights faced an even crueler reality: betrayal by the very lords they had served and risked their lives for. For a medieval knight, loyalty was everything. Knights swore oaths of fealty to their lords, pledging service, obedience, and sometimes even their lives. In return, they were promised protection, rewards, and prestige. Yet in practice, loyalty was often a one-way street. Many knights discovered the hard way that their lords were unreliable, self-interested, or outright treacherous, making betrayal a constant threat. Betrayal could take many forms. Sometimes it was financial. A lord might promise land, money, or spoils of war and then refuse payment. Knights who had spent years in service, risking life and limb, could find themselves penniless and abandoned. Armor, horses, and weapons required maintenance, and without resources, a knight's career could quickly collapse. Political betrayal was another danger. Lords frequently switched alliances, engaged in disputes, or fought wars without consulting their knights. A loyal knight might find himself fighting against former allies or caught in conflicts that served the interests of his lord more than his own. In such cases, survival depended less on skill and more on luck and adaptability. Some lords actively betrayed their knights. Promises of rewards or command positions could be given as empty gestures, meant to motivate service without intention of fulfillment. Knights who challenged a lord's decisions risked losing favor, land, or life. Accusations of treason, false rumors, and political manipulation were common. In many cases, loyal knights suffered because of their lord's ambition or paranoia. During battle, betrayal could be literal. Lords might abandon certain knights to save themselves or use them as expendable pawns. Strategic decisions were not always made with a knight's well-being in mind. Being ordered into a hopeless situation, left unsupported, or sent into traps was a reality many knights faced. Armor and skill offered little protection against deliberate abandonment. Even within a lord's household, knights were not safe. Rivalries among courtiers, jealousy from fellow knights, and manipulation by advisors could place a loyal knight in jeopardy. A single misstep, poor judgment, or unlucky association could lead to punishment, exile, or execution. Trust was scarce, and vigilance was constant. Some knights were betrayed over succession disputes. When a lord died, the distribution of land, wealth, and favor could shift suddenly. Knights who had supported the previous lord might be stripped of privileges, challenged, or marginalized by a new ruler. Alliances that had once been safe became dangerous overnight. This culture of betrayal created chronic stress. Knights had to remain politically aware at all times, balancing service, loyalty, and survival. Paranoia was natural. Every decision, every word, and every alliance could be scrutinized or twisted against them. Even heroic deeds could be interpreted as threats or challenges to authority. Betrayal also affected morale and mental health. Knights who gave years of service only to be abandoned or cheated often felt despair, anger, and disillusionment. The ideals of honor, loyalty, and chivalry were undermined by harsh realities. Many knights questioned the value of their sacrifices, realizing that glory was fleeting and promises were unreliable. In short, the life of a knight was filled with constant uncertainty, not only from enemies on the battlefield but from the very people they served. Lords, masters, and rulers were not always just or honorable, and even the most faithful knight could become a victim of treachery. This reality, combined with disease, poverty, and danger, made medieval knighthood far less romantic than legends suggest. And yet, for all these challenges, knights were also expected to maintain courage, reputation, and composure. Their personal lives, marriage, family, and legacy, added another layer of complexity, frustration, and potential misery. The life of a medieval knight extended beyond battlefields and service to lords. It also involved marriage, family, and personal responsibilities that were often sources of stress, disappointment, and sacrifice. While romantic tales depict knights finding love and honor in their private lives, reality was far less idyllic. Marriage and family obligations added another layer of pressure to a life already filled with danger and hardship. Knights rarely married for love. Marriages were strategic, designed to secure alliances, wealth, or political advantage. A knight might be paired with a noblewoman from a distant region, chosen for her family connections or dowry rather than personal compatibility. Romantic ideals were secondary to social and economic considerations. This often led to tension, isolation, and resentment within households. Dowries and land agreements were significant sources of stress. A knight's family and the bride's family often negotiated for months, sometimes years. Financial expectations were high. Knights had to provide proof of wealth or promise future rewards to secure advantageous matches. Failure to meet these expectations could damage reputation, reduce marriage prospects, or even provoke disputes between families. Raising children was another challenge. Knights were often absent due to battles, tournaments, or service to lords. Long absences meant limited involvement in child-rearing. Mothers managed households alone, while knights were expected to provide financial support and protection. This separation strained family relationships and created emotional burdens that lasted for years. Heirs carried immense pressure. The continuation of family lines, inheritance of lands, and the preservation of reputation depended on the success of children. Knights were responsible for training sons in combat, etiquette, and loyalty, ensuring they were capable of continuing the family legacy. Failure in this area could be seen as a personal and familial disgrace. Wives faced their own difficulties, and a knight's responsibilities often extended to supporting her safety and well-being. Castles could be dangerous places. Peasant revolts, rival families, or political instability threatened noble households. Knights were expected to defend their families and manage estates, juggling these duties alongside military obligations. Balancing personal and professional responsibilities was exhausting. Emotional strain was constant. Knights often formed attachments and friendships in military service, but could not maintain them due to long campaigns. The combination of duty, travel, and dangerous work left little time for personal connections. Loneliness and isolation were common, even among those who were married. Death and loss were frequent. Children and spouses were vulnerable to disease, famine, and violence. Knights could witness the loss of loved ones while far from home, powerless to intervene. Grief was compounded by the lack of emotional support and societal expectations that men remained stoic and strong. Even daily family life was regimented and challenging. Knights had to manage households, oversee servants, ensure provisions, and maintain equipment, all while maintaining appearances of nobility. The workload, combined with battles, travel, and political obligations, left little room for rest or personal enjoyment. In short, the personal and family life of a knight was rarely a source of comfort. Marriages were often strategic rather than affectionate. Children were both a blessing and a burden, and emotional satisfaction was rare. Personal happiness was sacrificed for duty, social standing, and survival, leaving many knights weary and unfulfilled, even off the battlefield. And while personal and family pressures weighed heavily, some of the harshest realities of knighthood were those that came directly from the battlefield, the kind that left permanent scars or ended life altogether. Battles, tournaments, and even routine training left medieval knights with injuries that often never fully healed. Unlike modern soldiers, knights had no access to effective medical care, antibiotics, or physical therapy. For many, Survival meant living with chronic pain, disability, and permanent damage, making life long after combat a constant struggle. Even minor wounds could become serious. Scratches or cuts from swords, arrows, or armor chafing often became infected. Without antiseptics or understanding of germs, infections could fester, leading to gangrene or other life-threatening conditions. Many knights survived battles only to face months or years of debilitating illness afterward. Broken bones were common. A fall from a horse, a heavy strike from a mace, or being crushed under armor could shatter limbs. Splints and bandages were crude, and setting bones improperly could result in deformities or limited mobility. A knight might retain strength and skill in youth but lose function in arms, legs, or joints as a result of battlefield injuries. Head injuries were particularly dangerous. Helmets protected against some blows, but concussions and facial injuries occurred frequently. Knights who survived head wounds often experienced headaches, dizziness, or cognitive problems for the rest of their lives. Brain trauma could affect mood, judgment, and reaction times, making combat, and even daily life, more dangerous. Chronic pain was an inescapable reality. Arthritis, muscle strain, and joint damage from years of wearing heavy armor took a toll. Knights walked with stiffness, struggled with simple movements, and suffered constant aches. Painkillers were rudimentary. Herbs, alcohol, or opium derivatives were used sparingly, if at all. Long-term suffering was normal. Loss of limbs was not uncommon. Battles were bloody and chaotic, and surgeons often resorted to amputation to prevent infection. A missing hand, arm, or leg ended the career of a knight and dramatically reduced his independence. Prosthetics were primitive and offered limited functionality. Life became a struggle for survival rather than adventure or glory. Even injuries that healed left permanent scars. Disfigurement from burns, cuts, or weapons marked a knight for life. Scars could affect social standing, marriage prospects, and psychological well-being. Knights were expected to maintain courage and composure despite visible signs of trauma, adding mental strain to physical suffering. Rehabilitation was rare. Knights could not rely on trained professionals to help them regain strength or mobility. Recovery depended on rest, luck, and limited home remedies. Many simply learned to live with pain, adapting slowly and painfully to their limitations. Some could no longer participate in battles or tournaments, which were central to their identity and livelihood. Psychological consequences were just as severe. Living with permanent injuries was humiliating, frustrating, and demoralizing. Knights often faced depression, anxiety, and a loss of purpose. The ideal of heroic knighthood, the shining armor, the valor in battle, clashed painfully with the reality of broken, aching, or disabled bodies. In short, medieval combat left long-lasting consequences. Even victorious knights could carry permanent physical and mental wounds. Life after battle was not a reward, but a continuation of hardship. Chronic pain, disability, and disfigurement were everyday realities that stripped the glamour from the idea of knighthood. And while injuries and disease made life painful, One of the most insidious aspects of being a knight was the constant fear of losing everything they had fought for: status, wealth, and reputation. Even the most skilled and courageous knights could lose everything they had worked for. In medieval society, wealth, land, and social status were fragile, dependent on luck, political favor, and survival. For many knights, the fear of losing it all was constant, adding stress and anxiety to an already difficult life. Land ownership was central to a knight's wealth and influence. Estates provided income, food, and resources to maintain horses, armor, and household needs. Losing land could result from political conflict, disputes over inheritance, or failure to pay taxes. Without land, a knight lost his primary means of support and a crucial symbol of status. Financial instability was a constant threat. Even wealthy knights had to maintain expensive equipment, horses, and castles. Armor wore out, horses needed feed and care, and weapons required repair. A single failed campaign, unpaid service, or unexpected expense could push a knight into debt. Debts could be fatal. Knights were sometimes imprisoned or forced into dangerous military service to pay them off. Political shifts could devastate status. Lords changed allegiances, kingdoms waged wars, and succession disputes were common. A knight who had been favored by a powerful lord could suddenly find himself on the losing side, stripped of lands, titles, and privileges. Reputation, which took years to build, could be destroyed in an instant by the whims of those in power. Loss of wealth and status also affected social standing. Knights who fell into poverty lost access to elite circles, tournaments, and alliances. Friends, allies, and even family might distance themselves. The pressure to maintain appearances was relentless, and failure to do so could lead to humiliation or social isolation. Worse still, recovery was difficult. Gaining land, wealth, or favor required political maneuvering, military service, or marriage alliances, all of which could be blocked by rivals. A single failure could trigger a cycle of decline that lasted the rest of a knight's life. Many knights who survived countless battles ended their lives in relative obscurity, struggling to maintain dignity. Even those who retained some wealth faced threats from unexpected quarters. Bandits, rival lords, or rebellious peasants could seize estates. Legal disputes over property were common and often violent. Knights had to spend considerable time and energy defending what they owned, even after risking their lives on battlefields. This constant risk of loss added psychological strain. Knights had to balance bravery in combat with careful management of resources, alliances, and reputation. The physical hardships of training, travel, and warfare were compounded by the stress of protecting what they had earned, or what they hoped to earn. Ultimately, medieval knighthood offered little security. Success was fragile, and failure could come suddenly and without warning. Many knights spent decades risking life and limb only to face poverty, social decline, or dishonor in their later years. The romantic notion of glory, wealth, and noble legacy was rarely the reality. And yet, despite all these dangers, disease, betrayal, injury, social pressure, and loss, Some knights still sought the elusive ideal of chivalry. But even chivalric ideals could be cruel, demanding perfection in a world where survival was never guaranteed. Medieval knights were expected to live by the code of chivalry, a set of ideals promising honor, courage, loyalty, and courtesy. In theory, these ideals shaped knights into noble, virtuous warriors. In practice, they often created impossible standards, adding mental, social, and emotional burdens to an already grueling life. The chivalric code demanded unwavering courage. Knights were expected to face any enemy without hesitation. Retreat or fear was considered shameful, yet real-life combat was chaotic, terrifying, and often fatal. Knights had to suppress natural fear, risking death while maintaining an image of bravery. Failure to appear courageous, even in moments of self-preservation, could ruin a knight's reputation forever. Loyalty was equally demanding. Knights were sworn to serve their lord faithfully, protect the weak, and defend the honor of their sovereign. But lords could be treacherous, peasants ungrateful, and fellow knights ambitious or hostile. Balancing loyalty to one's lord, family, and allies required constant vigilance. Misjudgments could be fatal or ruinous, yet deviation from the code was socially unacceptable. Chivalry also demanded generosity and justice. Knights were supposed to protect the poor, distribute rewards fairly, and act honorably in tournaments and battles. In reality, knights often had to enforce taxes, fight civilians, or seize property. Idealistic behavior could conflict with survival, and the gap between expectation and reality caused frustration, guilt, and moral tension. Courtesy and refinement were required as well. Knights were expected to participate in feasts, ceremonies, and social interactions with grace, politeness, and sophistication. Mistakes in manners, speech, or attire could lead to humiliation or loss of favor. A knight could be a master on the battlefield, yet appear foolish or inadequate in courtly settings, constantly juggling multiple personas. The pressure to uphold chivalric ideals was relentless. Knights were measured not only by skill and bravery, but by moral conduct, public image, and reputation. Every action, on the battlefield, in tournaments, or at court, was scrutinized. Failure to live up to the ideals of chivalry could lead to social ostracism, ridicule, or even accusations of cowardice or betrayal. Moreover, chivalry was often unattainable. Knights were human, subject to fear, fatigue, injury, and error. They could not always meet the lofty expectations of courage, loyalty, or moral perfection. The dissonance between ideal and reality created chronic stress, guilt, and dissatisfaction. Many knights spent their lives striving for a standard they could never fully achieve. Even death did not absolve knights from the pressure of chivalry. Funerals and memorials often emphasized heroism and virtue, sometimes embellishing or ignoring the hardships, failures, and moral compromises of real life. Knights were remembered as ideals, not as the exhausted, injured, stressed, and often unlucky men they truly were. In short, the code of chivalry, while glorified in literature, was a source of constant psychological strain. Knights were expected to embody perfection in courage, morality, loyalty, and refinement, all while enduring pain, poverty, disease, betrayal, and social tension. It was a life of relentless pressure, where survival alone often counted as failure. Yet despite all these burdens, some knights found brief moments of pride, satisfaction, or companionship, fleeting rewards in a life dominated by struggle. And finally, after decades of hardship, fear, and sacrifice, the last chapter of the knight's story reveals the ultimate truth of their existence. After decades of service, battle, injury, and stress, many medieval knights faced a sobering truth. Their life was rarely the romantic adventure told in stories. The reality was far harsher, dominated by physical exhaustion, constant danger, financial uncertainty, and social pressures. Even those who survived battles, disease, and political intrigue often ended life weary, injured, and disappointed. Knights who reached old age bore the cumulative weight of years spent in relentless struggle. Broken bones, chronic pain, and lasting injuries reminded them daily of the dangers they had endured. Wounds that never fully healed made walking, riding, or even simple tasks a painful ordeal. Survival often felt like a triumph, but it came with a lifelong cost to the body and spirit. Financial security was rare. Only a fortunate few amassed wealth, land, or influence sufficient to live comfortably in retirement. Many knights ended life in modest circumstances, relying on limited pensions or the support of relatives. The lavish lifestyle associated with knighthood was often temporary, disappearing as quickly as a lord's favor or battlefield success. Social isolation was another common reality. Friends and comrades were often dead or retired. Rivalry, betrayal, and political shifts had fractured relationships. Knights who had once been celebrated found themselves marginalized, forgotten, or mocked. Even within noble circles, respect depended on continuing success, leaving aging knights on the outside. The psychological toll was significant. Centuries of violence, danger, and moral compromise shaped knights in ways that literature rarely captured. Fear, grief, and stress were constant companions, and mental scars persisted long after battles ended. Knights had to reconcile the ideals of chivalry with the brutal realities they had lived, often realizing that true honor and glory were fleeting or unattainable. Death, when it came, was often the final release from relentless hardship. Some knights died on battlefields, achieving the heroic endings celebrated in legends. Others passed quietly, victims of disease, infection, or the cumulative effects of a life of stress and injury. For most, there was little fanfare, only the quiet passing of a man who had endured far more than most could imagine. Ultimately, the life of a medieval knight was a paradox. Knights were warriors celebrated in literature, symbols of courage, honor, and nobility. Yet behind the shining armor and heroic tales lay a reality filled with suffering, risk, and disappointment. Battles were chaotic and deadly, daily life was harsh, and loyalty, honor, and service offered no guarantees of reward or survival. For every knight who achieved lasting fame or wealth, countless others struggled, failed, or died anonymously. The romanticized ideal of knighthood, the gallant hero, the fearless warrior, the noble protector, was rarely realized. Most knights lived under a relentless weight of physical, social, and psychological burdens, proving that the life of a knight, as glamorous as it seemed in stories, was truly a life of hardship. And so, when one reflects on the medieval knight, the image of shining armor, heroic battles, and courtly love fades. What remains is a story of endurance, struggle, and sacrifice. A story that reminds us that glory often comes at an immense cost, and that the reality behind legends can be far less comforting than the tales we tell for sleep. Before knights could even face battle, they spent years, sometimes decades, training their bodies, minds, and weapons. This training was relentless, grueling, and often monotonous. Young squires started as early as 7 years old, practicing with wooden swords, lifting heavy armor, and learning horsemanship under strict supervision. The training regimen was physically punishing. Long hours were spent carrying armor, running drills, and practicing combat moves, often until exhaustion set in. Mistakes were punished, sometimes with humiliation or harsh discipline. Knights had to endure repeated falls from horses, bruises, and sprains, building resilience at the cost of constant pain. Mental discipline was equally demanding. Squiring taught patience, obedience, and strategic thinking. Lessons in loyalty, courtly behavior, and etiquette added layers of pressure. Squires were expected to memorize codes of conduct, prayer rituals, and technical instructions for weapons, all while enduring the physical strain of training. Failure was not an option. A squire who struggled to master a skill or horse-riding technique risked ridicule from peers, disdain from mentors, and even dismissal from the path to knighthood. Many never became knights because the training proved too exhausting, painful, or psychologically overwhelming. Even after becoming a knight, training continued. Combat skills had to be maintained, weapons repaired, and horses trained. Every day demanded attention to both body and equipment. The life of a knight was one of continuous preparation, with little downtime, and no guarantee that the skills developed would ever save them in actual battle. In short, before glory there was endless drudgery, long hours of exhausting practice, harsh discipline, and constant evaluation. Knights were forged through suffering long before they ever faced their first enemy. Despite their image as elite warriors, knights often struggled with nutrition and hunger. Their diet was far from the hearty feasts depicted in stories and paintings. Meals were inconsistent, monotonous, and lacked essential nutrients, leaving knights physically weaker than we might imagine. A typical day in camp or on the move might consist of stale bread, salted meat, and whatever vegetables were available. Fresh fruit, dairy, or grains were rare luxuries. During long campaigns, food shortages were common, and knights frequently went hungry for days. Their bodies, expected to perform feats of strength and endurance, were often undernourished. Hunting could supplement food, but it was not guaranteed. Wild game was scarce, and hunting required time and energy. Knights often had to rely on peasant provisions, which could be limited or withheld. Rations were meager, and competition for food among soldiers created tension and frustration. Alcohol, particularly ale or watered wine, often served as a substitute for clean water. While it helped prevent illness from contaminated sources, it did not provide nutrition and could exacerbate dehydration. Over time, poor diet led to fatigue, weakened immunity, and slower recovery from injuries. Feasts were rare exceptions. When knights did enjoy grand meals, they were often ceremonious rather than regular. The spectacle of eating with nobles came with obligations, etiquette, and scrutiny. Overindulgence was frowned upon, and misuse of resources could damage status or favor. In short, knights often lived in a state of constant mild hunger, balancing physical exertion with insufficient nutrition. The idea of a knight thriving on lavish banquets is largely a myth. Most survived on simple, repetitive meals that left them malnourished and exhausted, even in peacetime. Knights were often sent on military campaigns that could last months or even years. These campaigns were grueling, exhausting, and dangerous, far removed from the romanticized notion of heroic adventure. Life on campaign tested every aspect of a knight's endurance, physical, mental, and emotional. Traveling between battle sites was physically demanding. Knights rode long distances on horseback, often through muddy roads, forests, and harsh terrain. Armor, while protective, was heavy and exhausting over extended periods. Knights had to endure blisters, joint pain, and fatigue, often while carrying weapons and supplies. Camps were uncomfortable and unsanitary. Tents offered little protection from rain, wind, or cold. Bedding was minimal, and hygiene was almost non-existent. Disease spread rapidly, as knights shared close quarters with soldiers, horses, and other animals. Illness could strike at any time, reducing combat effectiveness and increasing mortality. Food and water were unreliable. Knights often relied on local villages or captured supplies, which could be scarce, spoiled, or dangerous. Starvation was not uncommon, and hunger weakened even the strongest warriors. Foraging could be dangerous, as local populations were hostile or armed. Battles themselves were chaotic and terrifying. Unlike controlled tournament duels, actual combat involved unpredictable threats, including archers, siege weapons, and cavalry charges. Injury and death were constant possibilities. Even victories could be Pyrrhic, leaving knights wounded, exhausted, and demoralized. Mental strain was relentless. Constant danger, poor sleep, and fear of betrayal or ambush created anxiety and stress. Knights had to remain vigilant at all times, balancing offensive and defensive strategies while managing their own safety and that of their comrades. In short, campaigns were a harsh, exhausting reality of knighthood. They offered little glory compared to the risk and suffering involved. Knights who survived returned with injuries, fatigue, and psychological scars, often to face yet more hardship at home, in service, or in future campaigns. Knighthood was not only physically demanding, it was mentally exhausting. Living under a constant threat of death, injury, or betrayal created long-term psychological strain. Knights were expected to perform with courage and composure, but the mental toll of their lifestyle was often overwhelming. Fear was a constant companion. Whether on the battlefield, traveling through hostile territories, or enforcing a lord's will among peasants, knights faced the real possibility of death at any moment. This stress could lead to anxiety, sleeplessness, and hypervigilance. Knights had to suppress natural instincts for self-preservation in order to appear brave and fulfill their duties. Witnessing death and suffering took a heavy toll. Knights regularly saw comrades, civilians, and enemies killed or maimed. The blood, the screams, and the chaos were not romantic. They were traumatic. Even victorious battles could leave psychological scars, as knights processed guilt, loss, and the consequences of their actions. Loneliness compounded the mental burden. While knights traveled with companions, friendships were fragile and rivalries frequent. Political intrigue and competition created suspicion, making genuine trust rare. Many knights experienced isolation, even among peers, which intensified stress and emotional fatigue. Moral conflict added another layer of strain. Knights were expected to uphold ideals of chivalry while participating in violence, enforcing taxes, or suppressing rebellions. The dissonance between noble ideals and harsh realities often created guilt, frustration, and internal conflict. Decisions had to balance survival, loyalty, and honor, but the right choice was rarely clear. Chronic stress affected physical performance as well. Fatigue, poor sleep, and anxiety weakened the body, slowed reaction times, and increased susceptibility to disease. A knight's mind and body were constantly taxed, leaving little room for rest, recovery, or reflection. In short, the mental toll of knighthood was immense. Knights lived in a constant state of tension, balancing fear, responsibility, and moral pressure. Even those celebrated for bravery carried invisible scars, demonstrating that the psychological burdens of medieval life were as demanding as any battlefield. Being a medieval knight was not cheap, and many people underestimate just how much wealth was required to maintain the lifestyle, even for someone who had already survived the rigorous training and battles. Knights were expected to provide their own equipment, weapons, and horses, and the costs accumulated over time, often becoming a crushing burden that left them in debt or in constant financial anxiety. First, consider the cost of armor. A full suit of plate armor could weigh between 45 and 60 pounds, designed to cover a knight from head to toe. Crafting this armor required skilled blacksmiths, precious metals, and intricate customization for comfort and protection. A knight often needed multiple suits for different occasions, one for battle, one for tournaments, and perhaps one ceremonial set for court appearances. Replacing or repairing armor after battles was not just expensive, it was sometimes a matter of survival. A cracked helmet or weakened breastplate could mean death in combat. Weapons were another major expense. Swords, lances, maces, and daggers had to be crafted, maintained, and frequently replaced. High-quality steel was rare and costly, and weapon craftsmanship required master artisans. Knives and smaller tools also had to be kept in working order while traveling or campaigning. A knight without reliable weapons was useless in battle, and even minor damage could render expensive equipment worthless. Horses added a financial layer that most people today can barely imagine. Knights typically owned multiple horses, each trained for different purposes: war horses for battle, chargers for tournaments, and smaller riding horses for travel. War horses alone required daily feeding, stabling, and veterinary care. They were expensive to purchase, and losing a horse in battle or to illness could be devastating financially and strategically. Maintaining a stable full of horses demanded not just money, but labor, which added further costs. Travel and campaigns further drained a knight's resources. Knights were expected to provide their own sustenance while on campaign, as well as support squires, servants, and fellow riders. Marching armies consumed enormous amounts of food, water, and equipment. Knights often had to prepay or fund these supplies themselves, carrying the financial burden forward while still trying to maintain personal equipment. Additionally, sudden campaigns could force knights to liquidate assets, borrow money, or rely on favors from lords who might not be reliable. Even daily life outside of battle had its expenses. Knights living on estates or in castles were expected to maintain appearances. Clothing, jewelry, and household items had to reflect status. Ceremonial duties required finery, while entertaining guests and hosting feasts added additional layers of cost. Failure to meet these social obligations could damage a knight's reputation, reducing opportunities for advancement, marriage alliances, or military favor. Debt was common. Knights might borrow money to repair armor, purchase a horse, or fund a campaign, only to face unpredictable repayment obligations. Lords could delay payment for service, or a promised reward might never materialize. Knights often became financially vulnerable, forced to work long hours or participate in risky campaigns to repay debts. Bankruptcy was a real danger, potentially leading to loss of land, social status, or even personal freedom. Managing servants and estates further complicated finances. Knights relied on squires, stable hands, cooks, and other staff. Paying wages, providing housing, and maintaining order added logistical and financial stress. Servants could be lazy, rebellious, or corrupt, forcing knights to invest additional resources in supervision and replacement. Every decision had consequences for both personal wealth and the functioning of their household. Unexpected costs could be catastrophic. Illness, injury, or the loss of equipment could suddenly leave a knight destitute. One battle wound could require months of care, during which the knight could not fight or earn rewards. Theft, ambush, or natural disasters could destroy property or food stores. Unlike today, insurance did not exist. Every risk was borne entirely by the individual. The relentless financial burden had psychological consequences. Knights were constantly aware of the precariousness of their wealth, leading to stress, anxiety, and a near-constant state of vigilance. Balancing personal expenses, campaign costs, social obligations, and unexpected emergencies required careful planning and tireless effort. Many knights lived in a perpetual state of tension, knowing that a single misstep could erase years of effort and sacrifice. Even for the most skilled and fortunate, maintaining financial stability often consumed more energy than battles themselves. A knight could return from war victorious, yet be financially ruined if he had mismanaged resources or been unlucky with lords and allies. Wealth, like status, was fragile, earned with effort, but lost with the slightest misfortune. Ultimately, the financial burden was a hidden yet unrelenting part of knighthood. Armor, weapons, horses, travel, estates, and social obligations were all costly, and failure to manage them could be disastrous. For medieval knights, survival depended not just on skill in combat, but on the careful management of money, resources, and social expectations, a balancing act that few narratives about knights ever emphasize. This constant struggle with finances added another layer of pressure to an already exhausting life, showing that knighthood was rarely glamorous, even for the wealthiest or most successful. For a medieval knight, service was not just a duty, it was a lifelong obligation that consumed every aspect of existence. Knights were bound to serve lords, kings, or religious institutions, and this service was relentless, unpredictable, and often unrewarding. The very essence of knighthood was defined by loyalty and obedience, yet the demands of service created constant physical, mental, and emotional strain. Service began with military campaigns. Knights were expected to fight whenever called upon, often at short notice. Campaigns could last months or years, requiring travel through harsh terrain, exposure to extreme weather, and a constant threat of attack. Knights had little control over when or where they served, and refusal could be considered dishonorable or even treasonous. The uncertainty of service meant that a knight's life was rarely his own. Every day could be dictated by a lord's whims or military necessity. Beyond the battlefield, knights were responsible for enforcing their lord's authority. This included collecting taxes, suppressing rebellions, patrolling lands, and maintaining order. These duties were dangerous, monotonous, and often resented by local populations. Knights frequently had to navigate hostility from peasants, rival factions, or competing nobles, all while upholding the appearance of courage, authority, and honor. Failure could result in punishment, loss of favor, or even imprisonment. Tournaments added another layer of service-related obligation. Knights were expected to participate in these events not only to demonstrate skill, but also to promote their lord's prestige. Training for tournaments was exhausting, requiring weeks of practice, travel, and maintenance of equipment. Injuries were common, and some were permanent. Yet skipping tournaments could be interpreted as cowardice or disloyalty, leaving the knight socially and politically vulnerable. Courtly duties also consumed a knight's time. Knights were expected to attend feasts, ceremonies, and councils, behaving with decorum and diplomacy. They had to maintain relationships with nobles, allies, and other knights, all while navigating rivalries and intrigue. Social missteps could damage reputation, reduce opportunities, or even provoke conflict. The constant need to be aware of one's public image created chronic stress and vigilance. Training never truly ended. Even experienced knights were expected to maintain combat readiness, horse riding skills, and weapon proficiency. This meant daily drills, inspections, and practice sessions, often in addition to other duties. Physical exhaustion combined with ongoing mental pressure created a relentless cycle, leaving little time for rest, reflection, or personal life. Service was also financially burdensome. Knights often had to fund equipment, horses, travel, and upkeep out of their own resources. Campaigns, tournaments, and court appearances all incurred costs. Failure to meet these obligations could result in debt, loss of favor, or a decline in social status. Even loyal service did not guarantee rewards. Lords were unpredictable, and promises of land, money, or titles were often delayed, reneged, or stolen by rival factions. Loyalty was rarely reciprocated in ways that ensured comfort or security. Knights who dedicated decades to service often found themselves marginalized in later years. Campaigns had left them injured or fatigued, and political shifts could render their loyalty meaningless. Some knights were betrayed by lords who abandoned them, failed to reward them, or used them as expendable pawns. The paradox of knighthood was that service, while noble in theory, often led to personal sacrifice without lasting gain. Emotional strain was compounded by isolation. Knights frequently traveled alone or with small retinues, away from family and familiar surroundings. Long campaigns separated them from spouses, children, and friends. Letters were slow or non-existent, and communication with home was unreliable. The life of service was one of constant movement and disconnection, creating loneliness and emotional fatigue. Psychological pressure was also relentless. Knights were expected to be brave, honorable, and stoic in the face of danger, pain, and disappointment. Mistakes were punished socially or physically. Every action was scrutinized, and every failure could tarnish reputation for years. Knights had to navigate fear, uncertainty, and moral dilemmas while maintaining the appearance of perfection, all under the constant expectation of service. In conclusion, the life of service for a medieval knight was unending, demanding, and exhausting. Every day brought physical danger, mental strain, and social responsibility. Loyalty was both a requirement and a trap, often exploited by those in power. Knights were expected to devote their entire lives to service, battle, politics, social obligations, and moral ideals, without assurance of reward, recognition, or security. The relentless nature of service demonstrates that knighthood was far from the romanticized image of adventure and glory. Survival required not only strength and skill, but unyielding endurance, careful resource management, and constant vigilance. In reality, the life of a knight was a continuous cycle of obligation, risk, and sacrifice, leaving little room for personal freedom or satisfaction. By the time a knight reached the latter stages of his life, the cumulative weight of years spent in service, battle, and social expectation became painfully evident. Knighthood, often imagined as a life of honor, glory, and adventure, came with ultimate costs that affected body, mind, and soul. Few survived without permanent scars, financial ruin, or emotional fatigue. Even for those who lived to old age, life as a knight was defined by sacrifice, loss, and relentless struggle. Physically, knights were often worn down by decades of rigorous activity. Armor, weapons, and constant horseback riding took a toll on joints, muscles, and overall health. Injuries sustained in battle or tournaments rarely healed fully, leaving lifelong pain and disability. A knight who survived numerous campaigns might still walk with a limp, carry disfiguring scars, or suffer from chronic headaches and fatigue. The physical cost of survival was steep and often lifelong. Mentally, the pressures were equally harsh. Knights were trained to endure stress, suppress fear, and remain steadfast in the face of danger. Over time, however, the constant exposure to violence, death, and moral compromise left lasting psychological effects. Anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress were likely common, though little understood in medieval society. Knights were expected to mask fear and fatigue with stoic composure, but internally many wrestled with doubt, guilt, and exhaustion. Financial instability remained a threat throughout life. The costs of maintaining equipment, horses, and social obligations often exceeded income. Rewards from service were unpredictable, and lords could be unreliable or exploitative. Many knights died in poverty or with debts they could not repay, despite years of service and risking life and limb. Wealth, like status, was fragile, easily lost in the chaos of war, politics, or personal misfortune. Socially, knights faced isolation and pressure. Alliances shifted, friends died, and rivals emerged. Maintaining reputation required constant effort. A single public failure could overshadow decades of service. Family obligations compounded these pressures, as knights sought to provide for spouses, children, and estates while juggling campaigns, tournaments, and courtly duties. Emotional fatigue was inevitable, and few knights experienced true rest or peace. The moral and ethical costs were also profound. Knights were trained to follow the code of chivalry, bravery, loyalty, honor, and protection of the weak. Yet the realities of medieval life often forced compromises. Knights killed, plundered, and enforced harsh policies at the behest of lords. Actions taken in the name of duty frequently conflicted with personal ideals, creating moral dilemmas and internal conflict. Living by these ideals while simultaneously violating them was a source of constant mental strain. Time, effort, and life itself were sacrificed. Many knights spent decades in rigorous training, campaigns, and service, only to die with little tangible reward. Glory was fleeting, and the romanticized tales of heroism rarely reflected the everyday suffering, monotony, and danger of a knight's life. Even the lucky few who amassed wealth or fame faced the relentless challenges of aging, injury, and political instability. The ultimate cost of knighthood was the surrender of personal freedom. From childhood, knights were bound to service, hierarchy, and duty. Their lives were structured around the demands of lords, campaigns, and social expectations. Even in rare moments of leisure, responsibility and vigilance were never far away. Personal desires, ambitions, and safety were often secondary to the expectations of society, making knighthood a life of persistent sacrifice. In conclusion, the life of a medieval knight was a complex tapestry of danger, discipline, and deprivation. Physical pain, mental stress, financial strain, social obligations, and moral compromise defined existence from youth to old age. While literature celebrates the shining armor, heroic deeds, and chivalric ideals, the lived reality was far less glamorous. Knights endured relentless hardships, and even survival carried a steep, lifelong cost. The stories of knights, so often romanticized in books, films, and tales, hide the truth. Knighthood demanded everything and offered little in return. Courage, loyalty, and skill were necessary but insufficient for security or happiness. In the end, being a knight meant paying the ultimate price, decades of struggle, sacrifice, and suffering, for a society that valued appearance, service, and legend over the lived reality of those who wore the armor. For all the battles, tournaments, and campaigns, one of the least discussed realities of knighthood was the profound loneliness that accompanied the pursuit of glory. Knights were expected to excel on the battlefield, maintain honor in society, and embody chivalric ideals at all times. Yet in doing so, they often became isolated, physically, socially, and emotionally. This loneliness was one of the quietest but most pervasive burdens of their lives. Physical separation was an immediate factor. Knights spent much of their lives away from home. Campaigns could last months or years. Tournaments often required long journeys, and courtly duties demanded presence in distant castles. Letters were slow or unreliable, and personal communication with family or friends was limited. A knight might return from a victorious campaign to find that months of absence had changed relationships or left loved ones distant and unfamiliar. The long periods of solitude fostered a sense of disconnection that could linger even when surrounded by people. The social pressures of knighthood added another layer. Knights were expected to maintain appearances, adhere to etiquette, and project courage and confidence at all times. Genuine friendships were rare, as rivals, jealous peers, and political adversaries constantly monitored behavior. Trust was scarce, and loyalty was often conditional. A knight might feel surrounded by comrades yet remain emotionally alone, never fully able to express fear, doubt, or vulnerability without risking reputation or status. Even within the household, isolation was common. Family members, particularly wives and children, were often distant due to necessity or circumstance. Knights were sometimes present but preoccupied, burdened by responsibilities, campaigns, or training. Emotional intimacy was limited. Conversations were transactional, centered on practical matters, strategy, or duty rather than companionship or emotional support. Loneliness in marriage and family life could be as severe as the physical isolation of campaigns. The pursuit of glory itself contributed to solitude. Knights were driven to achieve recognition in tournaments, military service, or courtly endeavors. Each victory or honor required focus, discipline, and personal sacrifice. Pursuing fame meant long hours of training, strict adherence to codes of conduct, and a lifestyle that few others could relate to. This single-minded dedication often separated knights from peers who did not share their ambitions or intensity, leaving them emotionally isolated despite their social surroundings. The psychological impact of loneliness was profound. Chronic isolation, combined with the pressures of duty and the threat of death, often led to anxiety, depression, and emotional exhaustion. Knights were expected to suppress natural emotions such as fear, grief, and vulnerability, further exacerbating feelings of isolation. Even moments of rest were often filled with worry about honor, status, or upcoming campaigns. The mind had little reprieve, and the emotional burden was heavy. Peer relationships were complicated by rivalry and politics. Knights were trained to compete at all levels on the battlefield, in tournaments, and in courtly circles. Friendships could be genuine, but jealousy and competition created constant tension. Comrades could quickly become rivals, and alliances could shift unpredictably. This constant uncertainty made it difficult to rely on others for support, reinforcing feelings of emotional isolation. Loneliness also extended to the experience of aging. As knights grew older, physical decline, injuries, and financial pressures limited participation in campaigns, tournaments, and social events. Younger knights assumed prominence, leaving veterans on the sidelines. The camaraderie that had once existed in youth faded, replaced by observation, envy, or irrelevance. Old age, even for the most accomplished knight, could be a period of profound social and emotional isolation. Despite these challenges, knights were expected to maintain courage, honor, and dignity. Expressions of despair or vulnerability were socially unacceptable. Emotional isolation was therefore compounded by the pressure to appear fearless and unflinching. A knight might feel alone in every aspect of life, physically, socially, and emotionally, but still be required to project strength, valor, and confidence. Even the pursuit of glory could not mitigate the loneliness. Achievements brought recognition but not companionship. Honors and accolades did little to ease emotional isolation. Knights might stand on a battlefield victorious, wearing the laurels of success, yet feel profoundly alone in their experiences, fears, and burdens. The very life that promised adventure and honor often delivered solitude and quiet suffering. In conclusion, the loneliness of glory was one of the most insidious aspects of knighthood. Physical separation, social pressures, competition, and the relentless pursuit of honor created layers of isolation. Knights could be surrounded by people and still feel profoundly alone, carrying the weight of duty, danger, and expectation without emotional relief. It was a loneliness that accompanied them from youth to old age, a quiet companion to every battle, campaign, and triumph. The life of a knight, as we have seen across countless hardships, injuries, betrayals, and sacrifices, was not only one of physical and financial struggle, it was also a deeply solitary existence, where the pursuit of glory came at the cost of companionship, intimacy, and emotional connection. One of the cruelest aspects of being a medieval knight was the constant threat of disease and infection. Armor, training, campaigns, and close-quarters living might suggest strength and invulnerability, but knights were extraordinarily vulnerable to illnesses that could incapacitate, disfigure, or kill. The harsh realities of medieval medicine and hygiene made survival a precarious balance of luck, endurance, and resilience. Even outside battle, knights were exposed to disease. Castles and manor houses, though seemingly safe, were crowded, poorly ventilated, and often unhygienic. Bathing was infrequent, and shared living quarters with squires, servants, and soldiers created perfect breeding grounds for infections. Small wounds, scrapes, or abrasions, common from training or daily activity, could become life-threatening if infected. Without antiseptics, antibiotics, or proper wound care, What might seem a minor cut could spiral into gangrene or systemic infection. Campaigns and battles magnified these risks. Knights often marched for days without proper food, water, or shelter, weakening their immune systems. Exposure to rain, mud, and extreme temperatures increased susceptibility to illness. Diseases such as dysentery, typhoid, and influenza were rampant in armies, often spreading faster than weapons could kill. Knights might survive a bloody skirmish only to succumb to an illness contracted during the campaign. Wounds sustained in combat were particularly dangerous. Even the most skilled knight could be struck by a sword, arrow, or mace, leaving open injuries that became portals for infection. Battlefield surgeons were limited in knowledge, relying on rudimentary techniques like cauterization, herbal poultices, or crude sutures. While some knights survived these procedures, many did not, and the line between life and death was perilously thin. Disease also extended to chronic conditions. Knights endured joint problems, malnutrition-related ailments, and lingering effects from past injuries. Arthritis, weakened bones, and muscle degeneration were exacerbated by poor nutrition, heavy armor, and relentless training. These conditions, while not immediately fatal, eroded quality of life and could render a knight ineffective in combat or daily duties. Plague and epidemics were existential threats. Periodic outbreaks of diseases such as the Black Death swept through Europe, killing millions indiscriminately. Knights were not spared. Campaigns could carry diseases across regions, and sieges often trapped knights in unsanitary conditions with little access to fresh food or water. Illness was a constant, unpredictable shadow, capable of ending a knight's life regardless of skill, bravery, or loyalty. Hygiene was rudimentary, compounding vulnerability. Knights wore heavy leather and metal armor that trapped sweat and dirt. Changing clothing was infrequent, and undergarments were often soiled. Skin infections, boils, and rashes were common, exacerbated by cramped living conditions. Washing was limited to infrequent baths, often in cold or contaminated water, which did little to prevent disease.